Okay, welcome back, everybody. I hope you all had a delicious lunch and got to meet some new friends. I certainly did. We're going to get started with our second afternoon session here. A lot of great speakers and so many cool stories. That's maybe a theme that's going to carry over. A lot of human interest stories that demonstrate some of the core concepts that we're trying to illustrate today. And we're going to get a bunch of really cool ones. And we're going to start with some of our friends to do an introduction. First up is Ambassador Susan Elliott. She's an accomplished diplomat who held a variety of leadership positions in the State Department over a 27-year career. In 2018, she became President and CEO of NCAFP, the National Committee on American Foreign Policy. It's a think tank that we work with the Korea Society frequently. Ambassador Elliott is a friendly collaborator with the Korea Society, and she's a good friend. She even came to my wedding, which happened at Mercer County Boathouse. She's not. She left. Yes. So please help me welcome to the stage Ambassador Susan Elliott.
Well, thanks. And what Jonathan didn't tell you is that he's really a native of and grew up in the Princeton area. So his wedding was not far from here. Yeah. So it was a great event. But anyway, thanks again for inviting me, to be here today. As Jonathan said, I'm Susan Elliott. I'm the President CEO of the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and this is a job I've had since 2018. Before that, I was a U.S. diplomat for 28 years. And I actually did not, in my diplomatic career, focus on Northeast Asia or Korea and the Korean Peninsula, although I did visit many times when I worked for Condoleezza Rice. But this has been great for me to work for an organization that oversees, we do a lot of dialogues, informal track 2 discussions among countries of Northeast Asia, including issues that relate to the Korean Peninsula. We have dialogues on, the nuclearization or denuclearization of the DPRK, which is why I probably asked my question this morning. But anyway, I want to thank all of you, and especially, on behalf of the Board of Trustees of my organization, I really want to send congratulations to the Consulate and the General of the Republic of Korea and the Korea Society for organizing this great event. It, commemorating the 70th anniversary of the relations between the U.S. and the Republic of Korea. After 3 years of having to do things virtually, it's really nice to be able to sit down and eat lunch with and have dinner with colleagues from, not only around the U.S., but around the world. And I also would like to thank Ambassador Kim and Tom Byrne, and you've met both of them this morning, so I don't need to say who they are, but thank them for inviting me to participate today. I really learned a lot from the first panel, and I'm looking forward, Janice, to the second panel, because I didn't, I was trying to figure out when the Korea Society invited me to come, why are they going to Princeton? Why don't they just have this in their office in New York, which is walking distance from my office? And so then, I didn't have to take the train out here. But it's just an honor to be in the Syngman Rhee Lecture Hall, because I didn't realize, I knew about Syngman Rhee, but I guess I didn't realize that he had such, he had graduated from here and had such a close connection to Princeton and the state of New Jersey. And I want to just say finally, again, I mentioned a little bit about the work that the National Committee does, but, we've been committed for a long period of time, over 20 years, to peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula and, in Northeast Asia. And I really just want to say again, it's an honor to be able to work with the Korea Society and the consulate. And in addition to Tom, Jonathan, work very closely with him. In fact, I guess he must like me or he wouldn't have invited me to his wedding. So anyway, so we have a great relationship. But we're really looking forward to, as we heard this morning, there's a lot of uncertainty. There are a lot of challenges that we're facing now in the 21st century. But I do think it's important. The ambassador said to me last night, and he talked this morning, about the importance of alliance. And I think alliance and friendships and relationships that are built, between and among our countries are extremely important to keep peace and stability, not only in Northeast Asia, but around the world. So anyway, thanks for inviting me here, and congratulations to all. And I look forward to this afternoon's discussion.
Susan Elliott, great job, Ambassador Susan Elliott. Thank you very much. All right, next up, we've got Soeun Gang. She's been serving as Deputy Director General for Public Diplomacy and Cultural Affairs at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs since March 2021. As a senior diplomat, she's worked for years on Korea-U.S. relations and peace and security on the Korean Peninsula. From 2016 to 2018, she was Director of the North America Division 2, and from 2012 to 2013, she was Deputy Director for the Korean Peninsula Peace Regime Division. Please give a warm round of applause to Deputy Director General.
Thank you for your kind introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very pleased to be able to take part in today's conference, and I'm most honored to be given a chance to speak. During session 1 in the morning, we touched upon the significance of the 70 years of our alliance. And when we talk about the alliance, much of the talk is about how it evolved, from a security partnership to an economic alliance, and then further to what we have today, a comprehensive strategic alliance that we have. And indeed, there's really a lot to say when it comes to the achievements of the ROK-US alliance. But the conversation mostly focuses on the state of the alliance or the challenges facing the alliance. But I think we all know that behind every success and every challenge, there are real people putting in the effort, working together, and rendering their support and interest. So among various groups of people, I think the Korean Americans play a critical role in the dynamic relationship between ROK and the US, as the conference organizers have rightfully pointed out. 120 years ago, in December 1902, 121 Koreans filled with hopes and dreams gathered at Jaemulpo Port in Incheon, and they set out on a long voyage. And 22 days later, in January of 1903, 102 Koreans arrived at the port of Honolulu, and they took their first step in the history of Korean American diaspora. So this year not only marks the 70th anniversary of the ROK-US alliance, it's also the 120th anniversary of the Korean immigration to the United States. So over the years, as Korea has really transformed itself from an aid recipient to a donor and to the world's 10th largest economy and also a culture powerhouse, the Korean American community has also grown. The Korean Americans have made their way into many parts of the American society. And I speak from personal experience because I spent more than 10 years in the US, including 7 years before I joined the Foreign Service. I have many Korean American friends from middle school and graduate school who are very active and proud members of the American society. Even in politics, all 4 Korean American House representatives were re-elected in the midterm election last November, including Representative Andy Kim, who was re-elected for his 3rd term, which is the first time for a Korean American in 26 years. And we also had Assemblywoman Ellen Park, who joined us for the first session, as she was the first Korean American woman to be elected to the New Jersey legislature. Now, as the 5th largest Asian community in the US, the Korean American community is playing an important role of bridging Korea and the US closer together. The alliance and also the Korean community, we've come so far, but we know that there's more work to do. During President Yoon Suk-yeol's visit to the US last month, the 2 leaders agreed to enhance cooperation in a wide range of areas, from security, industry, science and technology, culture, to global issues. Our leaders also agreed to deepen people-to-people ties between our future generations. And I think the Korean American community has a substantial role to play in further developing the alliance, whether it be within the government, a business, or in the academia. So I look forward to an active and lively discussion in today's session and the exchange of many insights and ideas on the role of Korean Americans in the dynamic ROK-US relationship. Thank you.
General Kang, that especially interesting story about that first immigration, really inspirational to see what it's transformed into today. You know, when we first came up with the idea, really the consulate came up with the idea to do the program here at Princeton University, I wasn't sure what kind of reception we would get, but I've been so pleasantly, not really surprised, but just such a pleasant response to see that really what it's been is a great big warm hug. And there's a couple people I want to thank. Eric Hamblin is over there. Has just been fantastic. You've really made this so easy. Thank you so much, Eric. Jeff, who's back there helping us on the technical side, has just been amazing. Thank you very much, Jeff. And everyone else who's helped. Peter back there doing a great job. And also part of that, part of our great big warm hug from Princeton University is KyuJung Whang, who's Vice President for Facilities right here at Princeton University. We're really grateful for his generosity and for hosting us. Thank you so much. I welcome you to the stage.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's a real pleasure for me to be here, and I just want to thank the Korea Society and the Korean Consulate for including me in this event. And came out of the blue, but I'm more than happy to participate and contribute to this great event. So, you know, as it's been already been noted, we're here to commemorate the 70th anniversary of the U.S. ROK Alliance. And also, many people have already mentioned how significant it is that we're in this room that's named after Dr. Syngman Rhee, who happens to be the first president of the Republic of Korea. And also that he went here, he attended Princeton and got his PhD in 1910. What hasn't been said about Dr. Rhee is that Dr. Rhee was a pioneer in so many ways, and one of the ways that I found interesting as I was preparing for my remarks is that he actually paved one of the first Koreans to attain a degree at an American university, and he actually paved the way for many future Koreans to consider a U.S. education after him, and that includes me. I was very fortunate to have attended American University, and here I am. So, as Jonathan has already alluded to you, my name is KyuJung Whang, and I have the privilege of serving as the Vice President of Facilities here, and I'm thrilled to be able to welcome you to our beautiful campus. You arrive here during a time of robust campus growth and expansion as we work hard to implement the university's highest strategic priorities of expanding our student body to give more students access to a Princeton education, to develop a state-of-the-art science and engineering campus, to perform cutting-edge research, and redevelop our campus-wide heating and cooling infrastructure using non-fossil fuel sources to support the university's environmental goal of net zero energy by 2046. So that's what you see going on around campus. You probably have seen a lot of cranes and construction fencing all around, but we're very busy expanding our campus right now. I am a Korean American and eager to learn from my distinguished panelists and speakers of the many experiences and engagements of Korean Americans that have led to the cultivation of the strong tie between our two nations. My own story begins in 1962, when as a 6-year-old boy, I left my homeland to eventually make my way to the US as my new home. I have much to be proud of about the life I built in my new country, my growing friends, my growing family, education, the jobs and positions that I have held, and of course, landing at this great institution as a cabinet member. My Korean values, including hard work, honesty, humility, and perseverance, have guided me steadfastly throughout my whole career. Being Korean is a state of mind that is something I am always conscious of. It is part of who I am, how I think, and how I feel. When I left Seoul, I thought I was going on a trip and that I would be returning. Of course, that never happened. It was never about immigrating to another country. Thanks to modern transportation, making the trip back to Korea is not too difficult these days. And I've been fortunate to have traveled back a few times, visiting family, rediscovering my roots, and finding new places to explore. Now I straddle both worlds as a man and global citizen, both truly American and truly Korean. Welcome to Princeton, and please enjoy the rest of the conference.
Okay, I'm going to start introducing the afternoon panel. So I'll do just as I did the first time. I'll call you up one at a time. Please come up as I call you. So the moderator for our afternoon panel is Janice Yu, who joined the ABC7 Eyewitness News team as a reporter in August 2022. Before that, she worked as a reporter and fill-in anchor for Fox 5 Atlanta. During her time there, she covered such items such as the 2020 presidential race, protests, and the Atlanta and Cherokee County spa shootings. Maybe we'll talk about some of that today. Thanks so much for joining us, Janice Yu. Okay, now on to the panel. And the first two people have transitioned between creative careers and into law careers. The first started out as a K-pop star and then became a lawyer. And the second started out as a lawyer and then became a film director. We didn't plan it this way, but it's a cool sub-theme to have for our second panel this afternoon. So let's start with Soeun Lee. She is a lawyer, musician, and writer based in New York. Once upon a time, Soeun was a performer and recording artist in the Korean pop music industry with 4 albums to her name. But after a decade in the music industry, she took a career turn and received her JD from Northwestern. And now she practices litigation and international arbitration in New York. Let's give a big warm welcome to Soeun. Next up, kind of the other way around, a lawyer turned filmmaker, and that's Joseph Juhn. He's got a passion for diasporic narratives. His latest documentary, Chosen, and we'll check out a trailer of that today, sheds light on the struggles and triumphs of 5 Korean Americans who ran for U.S. Congress in 2020. In other news, Joseph was recently married, and as in just a few weeks ago, coming right off of his marriage, and his wife is actually here today, so we wish you both a big congratulations and welcome to Joseph. It's also his birthday. Heard a happy birthday song before. Get to the bottom of that mystery. Next up is Dr. Travis Tae Oh. He's an assistant professor of marketing at Yeshiva University who completed his PhD in marketing at Columbia University. His research primarily examines the underlying psychological processes and meanings of consumer experiences with a focus on conceptualizing and investigating fun in people's lives. He's also a sommelier, so you can ask him about wine too if you'd like. Thank you for joining us, Travis. And last up, we've got Tim Hwang. He is currently the founder and CEO of FiscalNote. This company owns media and news companies CK Roll Call Group, which it acquired from the Economist Group in 2018, and creates a technology platform that combines award-winning journalism along with products and services that provide access to large quantities of data, news, and analysis for all levels of government. Thank you for joining us, Tim. Best part of my day because I get to turn it over to you, Janice.
All right. Do I need a mic or can people hear me? Oh, okay, I'll use the mic. Hello, hello. All right. Hello, everyone. Happy birthday. Congratulations on your marriage. A lot going on here. It's your honeymoon. How's your wife feel about that? Well, thank you for spending your birthday with us. In our session, I just really want to have kind of an organic conversation because already, judging by what Jonathan said about everyone here, I mean, such unique experiences, right? It sounds like we dabble in different parts. And so just even for myself, and it's interesting to see, I mean, I was born in Seoul. I moved when I was 3. Technically, English was my second language. Now I speak for a living. You know, that's all I do. And my dad, we all came because my dad was going to school. you know, and he got his PhD, and we've been here ever since. So I'm really excited to kind of talk about everyone's experiences maybe growing up. And that kind of leads me to my first question is, as you guys were growing up or, you know, working here in the US, like, did you guys feel connected to the Korean community at large? Like, I grew up in Tucson, Arizona, not a huge Korean population there unless you go to church. So that was it for me. So I'm just curious to see, I'm going to throw it out to the panelists. I mean, what was your experience like growing up or working here?
Hi, everybody. I guess I'll start since I'm next to you. So my journey is a little bit similar to yours, actually. I spent from age 5 to 10 in the States, and then I went back to Korea for, you know, all my schooling afterwards. And I actually was in Morgantown, West Virginia, which is not the most diverse place in the world, especially in the late 80s. And so to your question about whether I had connections to Korea growing up, I think the way that I found that was through my parents. And I really am so grateful to them because they always spoke the language. They let me read those books. They encouraged that. I was forced to go to Korean school, which I hated, but I'm very happy that I did so. Even if I did, when I went back to Korea, I struggled for a while with the language and the culture. But I think what's really gratifying to see in today's age is that my daughter or our kids and younger people these days have a completely different experience because being Korean is cool. There's so much culture, there's so much literature, there's companies, there's people that you can look up to, that you can see in front of your eyes. And it's not a faraway dream. And so I think that the world has changed for the better, and I hope it continues to do so.
Like Soeun, I don't think I'm a perfect representative of a stereotypical Korean American. Because although I was born here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, when my dad was getting his degrees, I quickly went back to Korea as soon as he finished his degree at the age of 5. And I came back at the age of 18. From there on, my lifelong struggle of identity crisis began, which to a certain extent still continues to this day. And that's why I think one of the major shifts that allowed me to jump from practicing law to making film was when I discovered by sheer chance the Koreans living in Cuba when I was backpacking there. I think that opened my eyes to see this larger diasporic narrative, which transcends this notion of binary, dualistic worldview that we often find ourselves in, confined between Korea and US alone. But you know, witnessing and befriending people of other Korean diaspora and other parts of the world really opened my eyes. But quickly, when I came back at the age of 18, I think you know, I try to understand what it means to be an American of Korean descent, ethnic descent. I try to understand what that means. And there, as you alluded to, there weren't too many people to look up to, because I think no one seemed to have really figured out what it means to be equally both at the same time and more. But as you said, much has changed. But I think a lot of my second generation Korean American friends had to bear the brunt of what that means, transcending your Korean identity and American identity to become something more. And so I call my generation the lost generation. And you know, if there's a social scientist out there, I think always the gap between the first generation and the second generation of any immigrant family is always the largest, and they have to figure out. And I think the second generation have to sort of understand and internalize what that means, right? But aside from that, I'm happy to talk more about my work and my passion for diaspora. Yeah, thank you.
Since we're going in turn, I'm also very, in a way, what some social scientists call third culture children. So I was born in Korea, but our family moved to New Zealand and Australia when I was 6 or 7. And I kind of grew up there until high school, but then went back to Korea for high school, then came to the US for college. So I've been here like 17 years or so. So as you can see, I don't speak New Zealand or water. it was part of that was I started college in Virginia, and when I tried to order pizza with my New Zealand accent, they did not understand. And so I consciously changed it, and through that process, not only the language, but the people I meet, the people I interact with. I initially worked for an ag equipment company, so I traveled a lot, meeting a lot of people in Georgia, Texas, in ag industries. And it really acculturated me into the diverse aspects of being American, because New York is not American. And all that experience really shaped how I see the world. I spent all my adulthood in the US. All my children are born here. My son identifies himself as an American Korean, which we go back and forth what that means. And similar to Soeun, my parents really helped me to stay connected with the Korean heritage, especially I think, and we'll talk more about that in different communities as well, but being proud of what your grandparents did, going at least 2 generations above and trying to understand what does it mean to be, my last name is Oh family, right, in the Korean heritage. And I think that's where I am right now, trying to figure that out for my children, who will be identified as Korean American.
Great. Well, appreciate everybody coming here to the conference as well. It sounds like I'm pretty much one of the only panelists that didn't spend extensive amounts of time in Korea, but for me at least, I view myself, very much like your son, actually, like an American Korean, and I felt like that for a very long time. I was born in Michigan. Very similar story. My parents had come here for graduate school, and very quickly they moved to Washington, D.C. And both my parents were working for the federal government and the U.S. government, and as bureaucrats, we sort of had this very fast assimilation into American culture. And I had actually grown up, interestingly enough, in the DC suburbs, where my high school in and of itself was actually about a third Asian American. I would say half of that was Korean American. So it's a very, very high concentration of Korean Americans. And I would say that there's sort of a couple different flashes of Korean American culture that existed. I would say the first is the church community, in places like New York or Los Angeles or DC, where there's a substantial amount of Korean American leadership and participation. Funny enough, the church that my parents had attended, our family attended, was a church called Global Mission Church down in DC, which the congregation actually is part of the Southern Baptist Convention. And so, which some people may find it surprising, actually, that the largest church in the Southern Baptist Convention is actually Korean American, with a congregation of close to 20,000 folks and the like. And so very, very large population, very, very large Korean American participation. Very similar to my panelists, remember sitting in Korean language school on weekends and the like, and essentially having to grind through that. But what's interesting for me, at least, is that as I grew up and came through my career, I found that came to sort of roots of my Korean identity, and afterwards had spent a lot of time going back and forth between U.S. and Korea, doing substantial amount of business or investing or advising and the like, to the point where during COVID I'd spent probably about 2 years in Korea, working very extensively in the market, and then very recently I've been working very closely with both the Korean government but also with many Korean companies and helping to sort of bridge investments into the United States as well. And so happy to talk about that journey and sort of talking about sort of how I sort of gone, I would say, from being 100% Korean, 100% American to sort of somewhere in between, I would say, over the last couple of years or so.
So you went from American Korean to Korean American.
So, something like that, yeah.
I love having conversations like this because we have so much in common. Like, we're so different, right? All of us sitting here. But we've all been victimized by Korean language school. I don't know if you guys were like my parents, where it was like, you're not speaking English in the house. You will learn English in school. My mom would not answer me. I would ask her a question. She would not reply. She would completely ignore me until I asked in Korean. So, I mean, that's these conversations, and it's not just us. There's so many of us, especially here in New York. I mean, just all over the place. So kind of going off of what we all talked about, I think we all alluded to it. It's a completely different time now, right? When I was younger, I mean, I didn't tell my American friends that I was listening to, you know, Korean music. They thought it was weird. And now, you know, I have people asking me, "Are you ARMY?" And for a while, I was like, "What does that mean?" They're asking me if I'm a fan of BTS, right? And all of this stuff. I remember the first time I heard Gangnam Style. I was in college, standing in line outside of a bar, and I was like, "Wait a minute. This is Korean." And it was such a weird experience for me to see that transition. And this was, you know, I was 22, and that was like a new experience for me. So the question for you guys is, what have you guys noticed? What has drastically changed in the last even 10 years or so that is making it easier for younger generations to kind of connect with their culture that might have been difficult a while back, like when we were growing up?
Do you want to go back down this way this time?
Yeah, okay.
This is
yeah.
very not the way that we usually do things. We're always jumping in, but let's try to be
Sure.
civilized.
Yeah. So I can maybe I can provide a perspective from the business side of the house here. I would say that the last 2 years in particular has seen quite a dramatic acceleration of U.S.-Korea business collaboration, and obviously this is part of President Biden's sort of Indo-Pacific strategy, and obviously the realignment of supply chain and semiconductors and electric vehicles and so on and so forth. But the strategy has been going back, I would say, even further than that. And obviously, as a startup founder, one of the things I think a lot about is, sort of the collaborations, particularly around very critical technologies like artificial intelligence or mobile technologies or cloud technologies in particular. And the cross-border investments, particularly in venture capital, have skyrocketed. And I think part of that is because of the increased level of attention that Korean startups have sort of seen over the course of the last couple of years. So major companies, certainly like the Kakao and the Navers of the world, but even beyond that, the Coupons and the Pemins and whatnots of the world that really have seen a tremendous amount of success in the Korean ecosystem, where global Silicon Valley style investors are coming to Korea to find companies overall. And so there's a very distinct sort of Korean DNA, if you will, that's very distinct from, I would say, even the rest of Asia, between Chinese founders and Japanese founders and Southeast Asian founders, where if you want to find, a great gaming company, a great entertainment company, great content company, great mobile company, the first place people look really is in South Korea. And I think that obviously, the threads of that have come from a lot of other things, in terms of the growth of the entertainment industry, which has really been in the works for the last 20 or 30 years. But I think in particular in high tech, we have seen quite a dramatic shift in terms of really differentiating Korean technology companies from the rest of Asia. And what's really interesting for me, actually, as someone who sort of sits in Silicon Valley and watches this sort of evolution, is that I'd say maybe even like 10 or 15 years ago, there was sort of this two things. The first thing was this inability to differentiate Asia-based technology companies, particularly China-based technology companies. And the second is this sort of very, very distinct flavor of Korean startups, which I think has really accelerated over the last couple of years. And so it's all, in my opinion, very exciting to see, and at least for the technology industry. And it's something that we'll continue to watch overall.
Yeah, following up on that, since I'm also in business school, we're seeing a lot of consumption or consumer trends or patterns change, right? As you've noted, one completely I would say judgmental or anything is I was working in on the West Coast at one point, and one of my colleagues who was there, who was completely Caucasian, white American, he comes up to me and says, "Have you ever had Korean barbecue?" to me. And I said, I'm Korean, right? And he said, "Doesn't matter," right? I said, okay, that's very refreshing. So I think it has changed, and this was just 5-6 years ago. And I think the notion of kind of accepting and understanding Korean culture in particular, not just as an Asian whole culture, but I think the understanding of consumers, understanding brands that come from South Korea and content that comes from South Korea is identified as such especially through a series in the last 2-3 years of Squid Game or Parasite or all of these things that have gained a lot of attention, and seeing a lot of non-Korean Americans watching it first and coming to us and asking these things. Where, so I had to watch it later. So it's been an interesting experience where you're not the one who's trying to kind of introduce your culture to the others, but where my American colleagues and friends are coming to me asking about, oh, I saw this, and what do you think of that? And I'm sorry, I haven't watched it yet. I don't watch Netflix much, but has been a very interesting experience for the last, I would say, about 3 to 5 years. Yeah.
Well, I certainly call it the Korean Renaissance. But I don't want to say that in a nationalistic sense. I think what's fascinating about seeing the growth and just this outpouring of the Korean cultural content globally is, I wonder how that's even possible, because for those of us who are lucky enough to have been educated in the Korean education system, the education system is exactly the same. And Korean teens have the highest rate of both suicides and the most depressed level in the world, like hands down. And generally, the suicidal rate of Korea is staggering, right? It's the highest in the world too. And I wonder what allows us to be so creative and to be able to create contents that are so high level. And it's a wonder to me. And some of my friends were joking that it's precisely because of the kind of social competitiveness and oppression that we experience as kids. The way that's manifested creatively is the outcome of what we see now. And there's, I mean, I say this as a joke, but I think there's some the truth to it too. Because I'm a documentary filmmaker, I travel around different college campuses to present my work. And one of the more dominant sort of responses that I get from a lot of the younger generation Korean Americans is that they've never taken Korean identity seriously until the recent sort of pop culture phenomenon. And that provides them sort of a gateway for them to delve deeper into what it means to be Korean. So I think there is definitely a positive role. Even for Korean Cubans, right? Korean Cubans were one of the earliest diasporas of Korean diaspora, because just like the Koreans in Hawaii that came in 1903, Korean Cubans went to Mexico in 1905, and some of them escaped and landed in Cuba. And because of the revolution and the socialist government, promoting or advocating for ethnic culture was strictly banned until quite recently. So the most Korean Cubans you would run into in Cuba, by the way, there's only 1,000 of them, wouldn't speak Korean until the younger 5th, 6th generation, for whom BTS is their like Fidel Castro, basically, right? Or Lee Min-ho is the most popular figure in the world for them. So now all of a sudden they have this resurgence of wanting to find out more about their mother culture, motherland. So that's been refreshing to see. But the downside of all this is, so what? There was Japanese fad in the 90s and 80s. There was a Hong Kong cinema fad. What substantive values can this K-pop and Hallyu really provide, not only to the world, but to the Korean descendants all around the world, other than the superficial self-glory, right? Yeah.
Oh, that's such an interesting point. I feel like in addition to the self-glory, there's a sense of, I think what's really important and difficult to gather from other sources is a sense of pride. And I think that's something that pop culture and culture in general has given to this new generation, the up-and-coming generation. When you talked about Psy, so I have a funny story. When I first came to law school, so I'd worked in the entertainment industry since I was 15, and I'd worked for a decade. And coming to law school was a very big change, but when I came, it was in 2009, and people knew that I had been a K-pop star or a K-pop artist, but it didn't mean much at that time. And so they would say, oh yeah, one of my classmates was a musician. She worked in the K-pop industry. And then years later, those same friends would call me and say, wait, were you like Psy? And it was this huge realization for them, and I had to tell them no, not exactly, but it's that type of it's almost as if, you know, it was something that was really transparent, and then it became more real as the influence got larger and as the audience got bigger. And I think that that has had tremendous effects, not only in the cultural influence, but also I think it's spilled over into other industries and opened doors. I feel that even as a practicing attorney, I'm not anymore, actually. I'm working again in the creative industry. But when I was at, for example, I was a lawyer at the ICC, and I would be participating in many conferences at headquarters in Paris. And, you know, networking events are awkward. They're nice and they're needed, but they're awkward. But it became so easy to start a conversation because of all the content that was out there, that we could immediately have some kind of common interest. And then that kind of paved the way for more substantive discussions on the things that we actually were meeting about. So I think actually the renaissance of culture has had spillover effects that are quite significant.
Yeah, and I think kind of as we went down the line, we kind of brought it full circle is, yes, it's great what we're experiencing now. It's so great that, you know, when I was younger, I was like kind of upset at my mom for making Korean food for my friends. And now it's like, oh, it's like the cool thing. Like she makes Korean barbecue at home. You don't have to go somewhere. But it's where we go from here, right? Are we just going to let it just be this pop culture thing and then it fizzle out? It's how do we grab this, take this opportunity and kind of push it forward? So I think, yeah, and I agree with everything that you guys said. So I do want to spend a little time just going individually, just talking about everyone's background and career and how that kind of ties into our overall theme. So I'm going to start with Joseph. So you kind of alluded, your film Chosen. So it follows 5 Korean Americans who ran for Congress in 2020. So talk to me about your idea behind this. Why this narrative? How was it received? What do you think was the biggest takeaway? What do you want people to take away from that? And also, we do have a trailer. So
should we go with the trailer first?
Yeah, if we can pop that up.
Right there. This is 100. So should we do it here or should we do it there?
Never before have there been 5 congressional candidates of Korean descent running at the same time.
My Korean name is Sunja. You think about my existence being part of a national tragedy, the discrimination and the stigma, right? There was stigma.
I'm forever grateful for this country that gave me the opportunity to realize the American dream.
My both parents fled from North Korea, communism. I'm running because I want to work with you.
My story as a Korean American story can be fundamentally an American story.
한인타운이 역사적으로 한국인이 당선된 분이 한 명도 없습니다.
Yeah, so David, he was so popular. He was like best friends with all the girls.
데이빗 김 후보는 아직 한인 사회에 널리 알려지지 않은 신인 후보입니다.
저희가 너무 프로그레시브를 해서 이 후보는 안 될 것 같다. 아마 한국 분들이 그렇게 생각을 하셔서
born again 크리스찬이 되라. 나는 공화당이라는 걸 데이빗이 알아요.
With my parents, I always wanted to be truthful with them, but I couldn't ever muster up the courage.
Thousands of Koreans working in South Central and Koreatown lost businesses they took years to build.
Koreans were fighting because police was not there. That's when our community really woke up and said, we need representation.
Nearly 3,000 hate crimes are reported against Asian Americans across the country.
The government does nothing for us. It's time for them to do something for us.
These young people, they have so much freedom and they don't know what they have.
This will be the most consequential election of our lifetimes. It's not just the future of America that's at stake, it's the future of the world.
I just found it offensive. I did reach out to the White House and I told them, why are you doing this?
We transcend the partisanship when it comes to serving our communities.
we can volunteer and fight for what's right. That's the America we're fighting for.
The making of Chosen, by the way, had a theatrical release in Korea last November and drew in thousands of audiences, and I still continue to tour around different college campuses to do screenings here. Why I wanted to make Chosen? I'm happy to delve into this because I was so glued to the earlier panel, and that's precisely why I wanted to make this film to begin with, which is 3 years ago, at the height of pandemic, I picked up a book by John Bolton, The Rumor It Happened. And although I'm not a IR expert, my depth of knowledge is very shallow on ROK-US relations. But the way John Bolton described why the peace talks failed in Hanoi, Vietnam, was basically this: the ideology of John Bolton himself, the sort of self-interest of Pompeo, and impulsive decision by Trump, right? He quoted these three reasons as the primary reason as to why the peace talks failed. I'm sure there's a lot more complex variables and factors that went into play. But when I was reading those lines, I thought to myself, wow, the fate of an entire region, the peace in Korea, is literally dictated by three uninformed, unrelated, white, old American politicians, right? I thought to myself, what if those positions were occupied by people of Korean descent who has personal relationship to the peninsula, or they had staffers or aides or people in State Department who are informed enough, who would have rendered a more peaceful policy towards the peninsula? That was my hypothesis. And it was around then I opened a newspaper saying there are 5 Korean Americans running for Congress. And I thought maybe they're the solution to Korean Peninsula, right? And I picked up my camera, I started following around all 5 of them. Interestingly, my film revolves primarily around David Kim, who's the only person who doesn't make it, but I happen to believe that he's the embodiment of the future of Korean America for a number of reasons I wouldn't mention at this panel. So that's why I wanted to make Chosen. I wanted to test my own hypothesis. If there are enough Korean American political representations in office, federal office, would the peace policy towards Korea be any different? Yeah.
That's wonderful. And it's just from a purely spectator standpoint, it's amazing seeing a trailer like this and being like, hey, they're speaking Korean. Because again, this is still something so new where this is not a topic I've seen a documentary on, and I watch a ton of documentaries. So it's exciting from a purely spectator standpoint. So I'm really excited. I'm going to watch it. So does anyone else want to add a quick comment to that? Otherwise, I'm going to move on. I know we're always up against the clock. So I'm going to, if anyone has anything. Okay, then I will next move on to Soeun Lee.
By the way, I was one of the students in middle school listening to her songs.
Oh.
And we took the bar, because I also went to law school, we took the bar at the same place. And I recognized her immediately, and I said, aren't you Soeun Lee?
We were in line to register, and he approached me, and that's when this friendship began.
Oh my goodness, and it came full circle. Now you guys are on the same panel. I love that. So, we've talked a little bit about your background. So talk to me a little bit about what you're seeing now. And you alluded to it, just the power of K-pop, Hallyu, just recognizable names. And how is that different now than what you kind of saw when you were going through it? And what does that mean for you?
You mean when I was going through the K-pop
world?
Oh, okay. It was a completely different world. So I debuted in 1998 when I was 50. Oh, shoot, that just totally gives away my age. But anyway, so I was very young. I was a teenager. I got a very good opportunity. I initially got my start by entering a singer-songwriting competition, which was broadcast on TV, and then it kind of led to many producers that wanted to meet with me. And so I got a very, it was a gift at such a young age. And the Korean K-pop industry back then did not have the system that it has now. I think there were very few companies, fewer than there are now. They didn't have the whole trainee system that's become a success machine for the industry. And so I was 15 and I just went straight to the studio. There were no rehearsals or choreography or image making or interview practice, nothing. It was just, okay, so what kind of music should we make? And so that was, in a way, it fit my personality because I don't think I would have really liked or enjoyed or been able to perform if I were so, maybe, for lack of a better word, controlled in that environment. But it's different now. And I think to a certain extent, because it's so systematic and so strategic, that's the reason it's so successful. Because if you get people to prepare and literally, the goal is perfection, then you're going to get somewhere close to it. And among those people who have been so well trained, there's going to be successes. I think that's amazing what the Korean K-pop industry has done. It's very different from my own experience. I do want to talk a little bit about what I think that impact means. So recently, a couple of weeks ago, I had the opportunity, I was in London for work, and I visited the V&A Museum there. And it was just, I had some time left. I was walking by, and I thought I'd make a stop. And what I saw was on front of the museum with this beautiful Victorian architecture, I saw a sign that said Hallyu in Korean in this bustling street in South Kensington. It struck me how impressive this cultural influence has become. And so I went in, and there was actually an exhibition about the Korean wave that we've been talking about. There was a book. There were, the gift shop was full of merch on, Korean dramas and films and movies and music. And what dawned on me was that the power that comes from the fact that it's everywhere is the familiarity, and how that familiarity it kind of leads the way to conversation and communication. And like I said before, I do think it funnels through, and it really affects other industries as well. Like, for example, when I was thinking about Parasite, which is a movie that I thoroughly enjoyed, I think everyone did. It won the Academy Award. And, it's mainly a film with a theme of showing social economic inequality in Korean society. But what I think happened was when the global audience saw that, they saw that the same thing happens in their countries, in their communities. And it's kind of a reflection of their lived experience too. And I think the power of soft power is what it's called, but it just makes us realize that we're not so different. And I think that sense of seeing other people who do not share the same background, do not share the same culture, not the same language, but seeing everybody human to human. And I think because it's it's a deeply human story, it has that power. And I think that's kind of where it's the root of the power that soft power has actually had on the world.
And I think it's, you mentioned Parasite. I think the reason, that movie cinematically, it's a great movie, right? And the themes, we all relate to them. But I think it's also important that people here don't just see like, oh, the extravagance of Blackpink or BTS, but these are like actual humans, right? You see them as humans. And I hope that was the takeaway from people maybe who aren't familiar with Korean culture, is being able to, peel back the glamour and recognize like, hey, their families are just like our families. They go through the same things we go
The
through.
everyday person, and it's so relatable.
Yeah. And so I think that's, you nailed it on the head with that one. So next I'm going to turn to Tim. So you are a part of this growing group of Korean American or American Korean entrepreneurs. So talk to me a little bit about your professional journey, up until this point. How did you get here? And how do you think the business sector, and you mentioned this earlier too, the business sector that involves Korean Americans, how does that impact the relationship as a whole between ROK and the US?
Yeah. So I actually grew up not thinking that I was going to be in business at all. I actually really wanted to be in politics. And Joseph and I have known each other for a very long time, so he knows this. But I used to be like a political nut. Like I was very involved in politics. I started off my career when I was very young. You know, I was 14, 15 years old. I was handing out flyers for my local congressman and knocking on doors and the like. And then when I was about 16 years old, a friend of mine actually ended up joining back then Senator Obama's presidential campaign. And so he called me up and he said, "Hey, you know, they're really short-staffed. They don't know who this guy is, and so they really need a lot of help." And so I was like, you know, I went online, I looked at YouTube, I was like, "Hey, why not?" You know. And so I went out to Iowa, I was in Virginia, you know, down in North Carolina for a while, you know, right during the primaries, and obviously there's sort of like this Cinderella story that happened, and obviously as we ended up going to the generals and winning the election, it was sort of like this eye-opening moment for me. And so I was maybe 17 or 18 years old at the time, and I decided, hey, you know, I want to try like something like this out. And so I decided to do something really stupid and run for political office myself. And so I was maybe 17 years old at the time, and threw my hat into the race and ran for the Board of Education in Maryland. I got something like 40,000 votes, and I ended up winning the election. And so it was very.
At 17?
I was at 17. Yeah.
He was the youngest elected official in the state of Maryland.
And so I was, you know, I got sworn in and did the whole thing, and you know, served out my term. Was managing maybe, you know, 30,000 teachers, a $4 billion budget, and I was just coming out of high school. And you know, I really thought about it, and I just, you know, it was a very tough time to be a politician, especially at the state and local levels. You know, at 17, yes. But in particular, the political climate was changing, and you know, we were sort of in this budget crunch crisis coming out of the recession. And so being a state and local politician, you know, cutting programs and raising taxes isn't like the best place to be. And so I decided, you know, and my parents were telling me to go back to school. And so I left that world and I actually went here to Princeton. This was I spent a lot of time here back when it was called the Woodrow Wilson School, and came out of this program, and then went over to HBS over at Harvard. And you know, I got another phone call from a buddy of mine, and he said, "Hey, you know, Jack Dorsey is starting a new company." Jack was the founder of Twitter, and so there's a new company that he's starting called Square. And hey, why don't you come help out for a little bit? And so went up to the New York office and just sort of saw this whole startup community kind of for the first time. And for those of you who don't know, Square was like a rocket ship. I mean, it just went straight to, you know, $50 billion in market cap, you know, over the course of 4 or 5 years. And I think it's now the largest digital bank in America. And, you know, I just sort of saw that experience and, you know, felt like the societal change that I wanted to create was fundamentally shifting from the legal and political society into the technology world. And so if you want to solve problems for small businesses, if you want to solve problems in healthcare, if you want to solve business in real estate, affordability, it's just endless number of issues. You have all these creative minds, you know, in the technology field that are trying to solve these issues. And that creative mentality was shifting away from Washington and into Silicon Valley, figuratively speaking. And so in 2013, 2014, I decided, hey, I want to start my own company. And so I grabbed 2 of my friends from school. We bought a one-way ticket to Silicon Valley, and we started bootstrapping our own business. And you know, our business idea at the time was to essentially create a Bloomberg terminal or technology terminal that basically aggregated every law on the planet and then made that searchable for lawyers. And you know, just fast forward 8 years later, we ended up raising, you know, $250 million in venture capital. We hired, you know, something like 1,000 people. We took our company public on the New York Stock Exchange last year, and it's been a crazy ride, just sort of, you know, building this business and scaling it up and the like. And so to sort of get to the original question, about 2 years ago, I started an investment firm, you know, as we were kind of taking the company public, and I started sort of making a series of investments in just, you know, startups here and there in the U.S. or in Korea, and just sort of watching, you know, as things were kind of developing and the like. And, you know, at first there were things around like, you know, affordable healthcare in the U.S. or housing affordability and whatnot. But very recently, I've been getting involved in things like electric vehicles or semiconductors or battery manufacturing. And one of the things you see, very interestingly enough, is just the number of Korean intersection points when it comes to high technology. And so I was sitting in a meeting with you'd be sitting in a meeting with folks from like SK or LG or whatnot, and they're so clued into sort of the global supply chain and how things are moving so rapidly that for me, it's so interesting, like being in the middle of Michigan or the middle of Atlanta and seeing like an army of Korean executives fly in and talk very deeply about American manufacturing, and so what I find very interesting in this time period, and this is something that I spent a lot of time thinking about even personally, was that for myself as in terms of my own identity as an American technology founder and an American entrepreneur, I sort of find myself very recently getting drawn into the Korean business sector, and I used to actually think when I was a lot younger, which wasn't super long, but when I was younger, I remember thinking that being Korean was a disadvantage. That you'd be in these rooms with all these people and they'd be discriminating or they think about you a certain way. But then just in the last 3 or 4 years, I was thinking this is such a great advantage to understand Korean culture, to understand Korean business customs, to understand how things get done, between these two countries, and then to serve as a bridge in these extremely dynamic and extremely growing industries. And so I think that's very, very exciting. And to sort of watch now, like I said, I'm not even exaggerating, like literally armies and armies and armies of Korean executives and investors that literally fly back and forth between Seoul and Silicon Valley and New York and Washington that are trying to really push tremendous amounts of sort of industrial development here in America, but also around the world. I think that's very exciting, and particularly as a Korean American, to sort of see that the two sides of how they're coming together, in the theme of this particular panel and the conference, and really kind of find a situation where 1 + 1 = 3, where the coming together of Korean industrial ingenuity and engineering and sort of manufacturing capabilities, American capital, and the American market opportunities is just so crazy and so opportunistic that that it's almost like a once in a generation opportunity. And so the one thing I would end with is it seems like there's obviously a lot of geopolitical issues, particularly with respect to things like battery manufacturing and electric vehicles and semiconductors in particular, and certainly the shift away from Chinese manufacturing and Chinese development into U.S. related allies is a substantial theme. It's probably one of the biggest themes in economic development in the next 10, 20 years. And right at the center of that economic industrial policy, the two major pieces of legislation that President Biden passed and Congress passed in the last year, the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, has South Korea right at the center of all of that development. The hundreds of billions of dollars in economic incentives and development and venture capital are flowing through Korean manufacturing, Korean businesses. And I think that's it's a very, very interesting opportunity and time period for folks who are very involved in these industries.
Thank you so much for those insights. It's always nice hearing someone. I'm not well versed in the technological world, so it's always nice listening to an expert. So last but not least, we're gonna talk with Dr. Travis Oh. So talk to me a little bit about a couple questions here, but a little bit about Korean American representation in academia and this idea, the psychological significance behind like consumer experiences, things that people like. I think you mentioned it earlier as we were kind of going down the line, but talk a little bit about your perspective on things.
Yeah, so one thing I've noticed also, kind of referring to Tim, seeing how business executives are moving a lot into the US, but another thing that has been happening across, especially the social sciences, and we have some academics in here as well, is that I don't know what it's like in the other fields, but at the very least in psychology, sociology, so the more of a humanities side of disciplines are seeing a huge swarm of Korean PhDs coming in. So at our business school, for instance, in Columbia, we admit about 2 to 4 PhD students per year. And for the last, I would say, 7 to 8 years, every year there's, including myself, every year there's been at least 1 or 2 Koreans. You know, we only admit 4, 2 of them are Korean. That has been happening for the last 7, 8 years, where you see our senior faculty. So for those of you who are not familiar, the main job that we do as tenure track faculty is actually research. So I only teach twice a week. All my other time is spent doing research, thinking about creativity, different things that consumers do. And when you look at the senior faculty who have gone through that academic process 20, 30 years ago, there are very few Korean tenure track faculty in the top research schools, very few. However, if you look at the junior faculty now that are coming up, there are many, many Korean academics in the generation of where I am. And what I've noticed is that in the past, of course, there have been like your parents who came for the degree. Most of them, I would say, were more in the sciences or technologies or sciences, biology, and so forth. And most of them, including my uncle, returned back to Korea. But one notable change I'm seeing, which I'm part of, is that after the PhD, a lot of academics in social sciences opt to stay. So instead of going back, that's another problem because despite having a lot of suicidal rates, only recently the Korean government has started granting research for suicide, clinical psychology. Only very recently. And so support for social scientists and social scientific research is actually quite lacking in Korea in terms of research support, although there's a huge support for STEM, right, engineering and science. And so what happens is what we're seeing is that a lot of social scientists and academics who I guess tend to study things that are more theoretical and conceptual would like to stay in the US, and including myself. And so that has been something that has been growing. And so whether we like it or not, we are in, as professors, although research is the big thing, we're trying to stretch the knowledge that we have in humanity, but we're also at this podium. So one comment I made was, I feel like I'm coming to work today. I don't like this. My semester just ended last week. But we have this immense privilege, and I would call privilege and appreciation, although not all professors think it that way, to influence the students or the younger generations. So as a Korean American professor, and I'm in a very unique position of working at a Jewish private university, where that's my former student right there taking pictures of me with his kippah, where as a Korean American professor teaching Jewish Americans in New York is a very interesting experience. And I think, and I can already see a lot of my colleagues going into a lot of these very top schools and business schools to be professors. And I think the representation of that will pan out in the next, I would say, 5 to 10 years. And that would be a very interesting thing where you have a lot more Korean professors up here teaching and doing research. Yeah.
Yeah, you make a good point about, so I grew up in this STEM world, not me personally, obviously, I chose journalism, but my dad is a geneticist. So the same thing, I remember his colleagues were all Asian, right? And then when I went to college, and I was obviously in more of a social sciences, no one was Asian. So it's kind of interesting hearing that perspective. So I do want to leave some time now for, we are a little bit ahead of schedule, but leave time for some questions from the audience. Well, that was super quick. Okay. Do we have someone who can?
Mr. Juhn raised an interesting question about the Hanoi summit, the aborted Hanoi summit, in which he implied that it's just these aged white men who messed everything up. My experience in talking to Korean Americans is that the Korean American community is quite divided on this. You, Mr. Juhn, I think stand on one particular side, but I've talked to a whole lot of Korean Americans who take quite a different view. And some of them are more extreme than these aged white men you're talking about.
Absolutely.
And some of them are probably a heck of a lot more extreme on the other side than you.
Sure, totally.
So you make of this dichotomy, in fact, this schism in the Korean American community?
Sure.
Which is epitomized by legislation that's now before Congress with 4 Korean American Congress people,
Sure.
Who has shared different views.
Absolutely.
So maybe you could talk a little about that.
I would love to. I think it proves that my hypothesis was wrong, was dead wrong. My hypothesis being, if Korean Americans were elected into a federal office, they can vote on bills that pertains to the peace issues in Korea, would we have a more peaceful policy? And I don't think that's necessarily correct, because as you alluded to, when the bill was on the Hill on ending the Korean War, right, 2 Republican Korean American congressional members not only opposed it, but they spearheaded an effort to mobilize to oppose it on their behalf. Whereas the more centric Democratic Marilyn Strickland and Andy Kim voted in favor to end the Korean War. I don't take a particular stand. I'm a storyteller, not a politician, but I found that dynamics to be interesting. Now, when I had a world premiere of my film at Jeonju International Film Festival last year, one of the audience members that came to watch the film was the guy named Jung-Jin-ho, Professor Jung-Jin-ho, who founded Pyongyang University of Science and Technology. He made a very interesting observation, which was, if you can summarize the modern history into 2 keywords, it will be a battlefield between the ideas of communism versus Christianity, right? It's a loaded statement, and I'm sure we can unpack this for days of conferences. But I think what he was alluding to basically was that the such divide, the socialist ideals versus the Western sort of Christian elitist missionary fostered Korean elites, that divide, that factionalism began from the independence movement from back in the late 19th centuries, where some members of the independence fighters sided with more of the Bolshevik sort of communist ideals that we can all be equal, whereas the other more elitist, Western educated faction thought, no, Christianity and democracy and the Western ways of thinking is our redemption. And he argues that that dynamic continues to dictate the presidential elections in Korea. And I think even last year, we witnessed some elements of that here and there, pointing to each other as communist or North Korean sympathizers versus a Western, pro-American faction, whatever. But I always found that to be an interesting case. And unfortunately, what binds and divides people, unfortunately, isn't so much of an ethnic unity or shared history. It's more of an ideology. And I think that also pans out in the U.S. Congress among the 4 members. So, my earlier comments on old white people making decisions for Korea is not entirely, I don't think, false, but it was more of a point to indicate perhaps a more hopeful rhetoric for Koreans being in office and making decisions for us, but that wasn't necessarily the true outcome.
Can I just add to what Joseph was saying? Because I saw the film, I saw Chosun, and I was very moved by it. And something that really stood out to me is, and it's a credit to how you told your story, is that members of Congress who, as you alluded to, voted against that bill, you got into the background of that story in the film. I think, should I name names? Anyway, one of the congresswomen was against it, and there's an extended conversation, an interview that the filmmakers have with her, and she explains how her family fled communism. And there is a conviction behind it, and you can disagree with her, but what was really interesting to me was it's all personal. And I think that's why storytelling it's so important, because you can give those personal stories, and even though it might not bring us together, it helps us to understand the question better and understand why there is a divide. And I think that's a good starting point.
One thing I would also add, just 2 observations, and Joseph and I had many conversations about this, but The first thing is that even the Korean people are very divided if you look domestically at domestic politics, right? So I think if you polled people in South Korea about the U.S. legislation to end the Korean War, it would fall directly along party lines in South Korea, right, between the GNP and the Democratic Party, who have extremely divided views on that issue, right? The second thing is that, generally speaking, the older generation, Korean Americans have substantially more conservative views than even in South Korea. And the reason why is because many of them had immigrated throughout the 70s and the 80s. And the conservative mentality that they had immigrated with them. And so the sort of social developments over the last 20, 30 years in South Korea has not really impacted them. So they're basically 1980s conservatism has essentially crystallized in American culture, which is where you're seeing a lot of that divide. And particularly, I would say if you took a immigrant from the 1980s that came here to America and stuck them back in Korea, their political views would probably be on the extreme right of the median ideology in the country.
I have a comment, and it goes along with what Travis said. I have a son who is really into STEM, and now he has a PhD in economics, but he also liked physics, math. And when he was going to school, we lived in Northern Virginia, so we were probably close by to where we were in Montgomery County. But all his friends were Asian. And so it was kind of interesting for me as a parent. It really opened up a whole world. So I guess when you were kind of thinking, because all your comments about where you felt different or weird, but it was really great for me to learn about the cultures, and I learned about it through my son. My son became friends, and I became friends with the parents. I lived near the Korean United Methodist Church, and so I didn't know Koreans were Methodists. So, because you have maybe, if you're an American, you have an idea in your mind of what an ethnic group might be. But definitely, and even when he went to graduate school, and his best friend was a Korean woman who studied economics with him at University of Pennsylvania. So, and maybe that's why I'm here, because my son has really introduced me through his work through that, and it just kind of the opposite of what you said in social science. Most people of Asian descent they're over there with my son, who doesn't have people the same as he is as his friends. So.
I just thought of a funny story. So I was at my daughter's, she goes kindergarten, so all the parents are new to each other. There was one particular parent, she was white American. She seemed very nervous, and she couldn't quite mingle with the other parents. Then she saw us, then she came running to us and hi, and she started introducing, and then she's like, she grew up in Fort Lee, where all her friends are Korean. And we were in the suburbs of New Jersey. And she felt very not home in the suburbs of New Jersey. And so she actually ran to us and was like, oh, are you guys Korean? And that was like last year. So it made me think of that.
I think right behind. Darcy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, actually, I have two questions. I could ask you a bunch of questions, but they're similar. I'm a political scientist, so I'm going to ask about politics. To Joseph, I haven't seen it from it, and I can't wait to see it. But as was kind of alluded to earlier, I'm wondering how American party politics played out in the story. Right, as was mentioned, Korean Americans are affiliated with Democratic and Republican parties for different ideological reasons. Right. So how did party identity and ethnic identity, as it seems to be a big part of your story, the narrative, how did that play out? And then to Tim, as Governor Murphy mentioned this morning, states are really interested in recruiting Korean investment, expanding Korean production facilities. So I'm wondering what impressions you have in all of your work on how in the U.S. state level politics or political leaders within states or private firms that are working within a specific state, how is that playing out in the sorts of expansion phenomena that are happening?
Well, I guess two vignettes on that on the state government side. During COVID, I don't know if it was a big or a small story because I was in Korea, but there's a story about how the First Lady of Maryland at the time, Yoon Hogan, had sort of structured a deal with Korean manufacturers to bring in COVID testing kits and PPEs into the state of Maryland faster than basically any other state in the country. And so I think that one element to this is that sort of personal relationships matter a lot, and particularly to, I would say, Joseph's thesis, but also sort of the broader thesis of representation. Whether it's there's a tremendous number, probably record number of Korean American elected officials, particularly at state and local levels, that have very deep personal relationships into South Korea, that have deep relationships via their families or via sort of broader extended networks that are bringing in sort of Korean investments and the like. The second vignette, I would say, and this is kind of a funny one, but it's, a couple of years ago, SK and LG got into a huge pissing match in Atlanta over a battery manufacturing facility. It's about $5 billion that SK had sunk into battery manufacturing plants. And LG, of course, was in there as well with their investment and the like. There was a whole host of issues around intellectual property and so on and so forth. So much so that they litigated, went to the World Trade Organization, and the person that ultimately decided on the outcome of that investment was President Biden. And so when you think about it for a second, take a step back, two very, very large Korean conglomerates fighting over American investment territory in Atlanta, litigating in an international organization being adjudicated by an American president. And so I remember sitting in Washington and sort of watching the tug of war between two major Korean companies that were lobbying, state and local politicians in Georgia, federal legislators in Washington, to try and get, their particular economic kind of component passed. And so I think that those types of things are only going to accelerate. Certainly with the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act and, of course, the CHIPS Act, which dramatically incentivizes American manufacturing. But through the lens of Korean companies, what you're seeing is that as those federal funds flow down into the state and local levels, the level of competition among Korean companies is extremely high right now. And so I think there's actually not a tremendous amount that needs to get done. The federal government has already lit a fire under the industries that just so happen to be the leading industries in Korea. And so we're sort of sitting in a situation where now it's a question of state and local outcomes, right? And so this is just my hypothesis. I don't know. I was just thinking about this the other day, but the reason why I think they chose Atlanta was because of Korean Air, and obviously Korean Air being Atlanta with associated with Delta, and the amount of back and forth flights between Seoul. But that's just speculation. But I would imagine that that's part of the reason why you sort of see a substantial amount of kind of Korean Americans sort of going back and forth in that field.
If I'm lucky enough to continue to be a full-time documentary maker, I've been promising to Tim that I want to make a documentary on him when he runs for president. I think the 2020 congressional race was an anomaly because of President Trump's his presence and the candidate's affiliation towards or against Trump made things quite complicated. It wasn't the traditional conservative versus progressive. It was, I don't know, sense versus insensitive. I don't know. But I actually, intentionally, consciously try to play down candidates' affiliation towards Trump because of a number of reasons. But I didn't want to create a film where audiences would walk out vilifying certain candidates because of their certain views. The whole hypothesis was to see, can we still peacefully coexist amidst our ideological differences? But American political partisanship played a huge role as a result of Trump and what he stands for in the larger American political landscape at the time.
I just wanted to thank all the panelists. I found your stories very inspiring. And I think Director Juhn mentioned the substantive value of Korean culture. And that's exactly the same question that I have. Because I work in the government and the work I do is public diplomacy. It's basically promoting Korea, trying to gain people's interest and support for Korea. And what we find is people's interest in Korean culture, it doesn't always lead to people's interest for Korea as a nation, and also, support and interest for the alliance, Korea-US alliance. So that would be the ideal goal. So I guess I wanted to get your views. Since this year is, the 70th anniversary, a very good opportunity to promote the alliance and at the same time promote Korea as a very good ally of the US. I wanted to get your views on, if you look back 5 years ago or 10 years ago, are American general public's understanding of the alliance, is it improving? Are people aware that this is something that's good for the country, good for the Americans, or and what can we do in the government, both in the Korean government and the U.S. government, to raise awareness? That's my question.
I'm just a storyteller, and I say this with utmost respect. I love Korea. My parents live there. I live there. I would continue to visit, but I'm not a politician. So I tend to be a lot more skeptical towards my perspective of Korea, not out of hatred or vilification, but because I love Korea. And just last week I was in Korea after the wedding, and I conducted an interview with Arirang TV on the influence of Korea, and they were trying to push me towards saying things that would make Korea look good. But that's not my job, right? Even my film, the only person who loses, David Kim, my film revolves largely around his failures and a lot of the challenges and the prejudices that he faced as being someone of a sexual minority who ran in a very conservative Koreatown, LA, and the hiccups that he faced along the way. One of the things that I did to prepare for the interview was I was looking at some statistics, and I came across this one report, interesting report by the U.S. News and World Report in 2023. They ranked 79 countries based on their racist sentiment. And one of the questions that they asked was, would you want a non-ethnic Korean neighbor living next door to your house? 30% of the respondents that answered this question in Korea said they don't want a non-ethnic Korean living next door. And Korea ranked 9th out of the 79 countries. Korea was the only OECD country in the top 25 countries that was considered to be quote-unquote racist. I don't say this to offend anyone, obviously. But as much as we try to highlight the Korean brand globally, I think the general sentiment that a lot of Koreans have in Korea against non-Western foreigners who reside there, or Korean ethnic Chinese people in particular, has been really worrisome, extremely. And I don't think without addressing these internal issues, but rather having fancy conferences promoting Korean global brand, to me is very problematic. So I think it has to be obviously two parallel tracks where we do our things as a government to promote Korea as a great country as it is, but also internally, there are so many internal social ills that we need to pay attention to, is what I honestly think.
Does anyone else have a question? Back there.
Hi, this is Juhn. I'm currently a master's student at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. What I have been thinking a lot these days is that what would there be beyond Hallyu, the current Hallyu? Because it is true that the recent surge in interest in Korean culture is mostly focused on the culture aspects like movies, the songs, and also the food, which the culture itself is powerful, but it can have limited influence on everyday life in American citizens or like political influence. So will this surge in interest in Korea continue to permeate and drive in other areas like business and academia and also politics? And also in such process, will there be any challenges that we might face? These kind of things. I don't want to be really pessimistic on this, but this is something that I have been thinking about these days, so I just wanted to share with you and listen to your opinions.
Yeah, so being a social psychologist, there are camps of theories on what culture is, right? What is culture? And the classical notion is that one person has a cultural system in which we're embedded in that culture that we're in. However, more recently, the dominating cultural theory is more something called polyculturalism, where all of us, we're not necessarily under one cultural system, but we're constantly influenced by different cultures that we encounter. And when you are, I don't know if those of you who are multicultural, when you are physically in Korea, you act and differently culturally than when you're in the US, because the outside environments influence how you act, talk, and think, which is all part of culture. And I think Hallyu and all of these pop culture things will influence to certain degrees how it will make non-Koreans think about Korea. Moving forward, in my opinion, and a lot of theories and consumer culture theories, there are three things that influence people's cultural systems. One is what we call rituals. So customs, traditions, we have the New Year, like Seollal, things like that, rituals. Then you also have heroes, who are the figures, like the congressmen or figures that you look up to, like the Psy or the Blackpink, whatever, it could be the heroes. And lastly, it's the symbols, meaning language or some sort of symbols. And culture, at least in social psychology theory, these three things influence how people view culture. And I'm not sure, to your question, whether it's some sort of goal to acculturate all the people in the world into the Korean culture. I'm not sure that is our goal. And then same through what Debbie has mentioned, I think it's more about how to present the Korean, and I guess in our case, the Korea-US relationship and alliance in a positive way, so that in all areas of industries or films or all of these can have a positive interaction with the consumers. Ultimately, we all consume things, right, that are coming from Korea. And part of that, I think, is beyond entertainment and content. I'm working closely with several more consumer goods products where they try to bring in some gochujang sauce. You see a lot of gochujang sauce nowadays in like Amazon and everywhere. You see things like kimchi in Costco or things like that that can start to become, I think culture starts from a very small aspect where when I was growing up in New Zealand, we had toast and I don't know if you know baked beans. Okay, nobody eats baked beans here. Things like that kind of influence you. Usually your cultural identity is strongly set before 15 and 16. So I think what is going to happen going forward is how much of this business relationships where things that are produced in Korea or influencing Korean culture will become part of, not necessarily all of, but part of the way people who are non-Koreans kind of live their life. And part of that is things like Japanese sake made it really big, but can Korean, being a wine person, how would Korean like traditional Korean liquor, things like that can come, and also that's one example. But things are happening. There are people who are very passionate about spreading Korean cultural goods, like the traditional liquor, into the U.S. as well. But it'll take time.
I didn't want to end on a very negative note. I'm so sorry. But one of the ways for me to promote the good things that come out of the peninsula, for me, is promoting the stories of diaspora. And one of the things I'm advocating for is having this sense of diasporic identity, diasporic consciousness, a concept which is akin to W.E.B. Du Bois' idea of double consciousness. We occupy both the center and margin at the same time. We not only attain this type of highlights and spotlights, but also understand and have empathy towards those who are on the margins and in vulnerable positions. And I think members of diaspora outside of Korea, who all essentially live as immigrants, children of immigrants, foreigners, aliens, who are often subject to Asian hate, violent crimes, are in right positions to advocate for such diasporic, hospitable consciousness is what I advocate for. So having, so that's my hypothesis.
think just a point, and I don't know why this conversation made me think about this, but I think of among the panelists today, I might, and I don't want to generalize this, but I think I might be the most Korean because that's where I lived there until I was 27. So I identify very much as a Korean, and I haven't quite become comfortable with calling myself Korean American yet. And so I just want to share with you a conversation that I had 2 years ago. I had the opportunity to interview some amazing Korean American novelists that are around New York City for a publication. And one of the conversations I had with this amazing novelist, her name is Mary H.K. Choi, and we were talking about what you were talking about, the Korean wave and how powerful it's become and how wonderful it is. And she brought up a point that really stayed with me. And what she said was, she has so much love for Korea, like you said. And she's very happy with what's happening, all the success, all the support. But she emphasized that when people come up to her and say, BTS is doing so well, Blackpink is doing so well, you guys are you're there now, you've arrived. She says back to them, but that's not me. They have Korea to go back to. I'm here, this is all I have. I am a member of the diaspora, and that is different. And so, for me, as someone who is kind of on the cusp of my own identity journey, hearing that was an eye-opening experience. And I think that opened my eyes, and something that I've been thinking about a lot when talking about, identity and alliances and relationships is how can we bring, because even within the Korean community, there are very different shades, I think. There are different nuances, and how can we all feel home is a question that I always struggle with. I think I felt that in law school. I felt that as working in New York. I didn't really feel a part of Korean American community, nor the Korean community. I just felt like a Korean living in New York. And that could feel very isolating. And it's only recently that I start to feel a sense of home because, I'm sorry? Yeah, actually because my daughter was born and I realized that, and she actually illuminated something that might have been obvious but was new to me is, I speak Korean to her at home, and she speaks English at school. And she would say to me, I'm Korean and I'm English. And that's something she always says to me. And I don't know why that, it impacted me a lot to know that you're not half, you're full, you're both. And I think what we as Korean American younger generation can do is to try to see how we can widen the community that we all feel instead of having so many hyphens in the name, that we can all be, people that want a better world and who have this identity and just kind of work together. I don't know if I got my sentiment through, but I that's something that's been on my mind recently.
Yeah, and I think that's a very good point, and kind of tying in what everyone said here, just the responsibility that everyone has. I don't want it to be like, oh, you have this burden on your shoulders as a Korean American who's in the professional world. But I think, and even me as a journalist, we went through with the whole Asian hate thing, the whole representation in news, the power that we have as Asian Americans, as Korean Americans, to elevate those stories, right? That's my job as a journalist. And so much like what Joseph said, in my mind, that is the way. We capitalize on the popularity of Korean barbecue and Blackpink and all of these artists, but also because that's so fresh in people's minds, capitalize on it. I do think we're at a time where people are more willing to maybe read a headline that says something about Korea just because they've been hearing so much about it. So I don't think it's going to take many years. I don't think this is something we're going to see overnight, but hopefully, again, like I mentioned at the beginning, this is kind of a crucial, pivotal moment is how do we move on from here, right? Like, people may say, oh, you guys have made it. Like, people know Korea, they know K-pop, but really how do we take that into our individual worlds and expand it? So I think
We're probably running out of time now. Maybe one more question? Okay, I got the okay from Jonathan, so we'll take one more question. Back here.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My question is super quick. As you think about your children and how they grow up, naturally, with a different environment, just assimilating into that environment, and just a part of you fades. And so, are you okay with maybe a certain part of them fading, and just naturally, or are you working to try to keep them connected to this part of family?
Last year.
Make them go to Korea school.
Last year, I was part of a Zoom conference led by Korean Russians, Korea-sana, and one of the professors by the name of Valery Khan, who's a third generation, who's Korean Uzbek, prolific scholar. He posed a question at the end of his seminar, which was, would Korean diaspora eventually disappear? And when I gathered the courage to ask him his own thought, he chose to remain silent and had us fill the void on his behalf. So maybe that's a good point to end on.
I'm confused.
This idea of would a certain population sever from their homeland for a prolonged period of time, would their identity eventually fade away? Was exactly your question, right?
Can I? That's a great question. And having two children, and also teaching at Yeshiva University, which is a Jewish American university, I think it depends, right? We see the Jewish diaspora has been around for a long time. Obviously, they're more tied because of their religious roots. But still, I can see and learn from them and learn from the Jewish community how they've kept that Jewish identity very strong. Despite the long years of diaspora, in fact, not even having a country for a very, very long time. But to your question, and I mentioned this before, so not just Korean Americans, but just everyone in general, research shows that if you connect your children to your heritage, you talk about your parents or your grandparents, whatever they did, and the more you talk to them about them when they are younger, it actually has a significant, we call significant p-value of 0.05 or more less. It's a significant positive impact on their upbringing later in terms of all these other measures. So it's actually not just Korean Americans, but any Latin Americans or any Americans in general, or just like regular Americans, or I don't know how to put that, to talk about your heritage and your backgrounds and trying to have that intact, I think can have a positive effect, and I can certainly see that in my students who are grown up Jewish Americans, who are very Americans, but at the same time very Jewish. And they're very proud of that. And I think that is where we could see one way of going.
Can I just add, is there?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I just want to say that, speaking not from my child's perspective, but from my perspective, I think there's great meaning and value in me and my husband, our efforts to reinforce my culture to her. And I think that in itself has value. And I think, for example, when I look back at my parents, when I lived here, it was 5 years only. But even though I said no at the time, I remember how hard they worked to instill my Korean values in me. And that hasn't faded, and I was 5. And so I think for my child, it might fade away, but the effort that she'll remember, I think, has meaning.
Okay, one more. I'm looking at Jonathan, and he's just like, one more.
No, I just wanted to make a point, and I think everything that you're saying is so important, and especially your remarks about being at the Yeshiva University. Because what I keep hearing is assimilation, where the goal is accommodation, right? And when you had said, when you're in the culture, people then, it's not so much they assimilate, but they accommodate, right? And they become both, right? They have an understanding, and doing what you're doing with your children is they have an understanding of their roots, but they live in a different culture, right? But they have this strength where they can accommodate. And they can accommodate not just to those two, but it makes them more likely to be global citizens, where they can go into other cultures and then understand what to accommodate to, because if you're accommodating, you're not threatened by losing something. So I just wanted to add that. I think we're saying it, but it was by using assimilate, it's like you assimilate, you lose something. You accommodate, you gain.
All right, I got the final nod from Jonathan. All right, well, that does it for this session. I'm so glad we were able to have these conversations. I know I'll be thinking about the conversations on my drive home, well, probably while I'm stuck in traffic, but thank you guys so much.
Thank you.